section of Exodus, which goes through chapter 20, deals with the deliverance of the children of Israel out of Egypt and then on into the wilderness. And there they wander around for 40 years. And we're going to read tonight again about how they were taken care of there in the wilderness and the help that God gave them for the full 40 years that they were wandering in the desert. And there's two more sections to the book. The next time that we meet, hopefully, we will be looking at the Lord's commandments as given by Moses. That starts in chapter 20. And their laws, and not only the Ten Commandments is in chapter 20, and there are many other laws that God reveals to Moses. Health laws, laws having to do with civil government, laws having to do with family life even. And we'll get into that some and try to break it down and not spend a lot of time on it to break down the major things. The third section then is rules about worship, about the building of the tabernacle, the details of the tabernacle, about who is to do the worship, what tribe, and specifically even the Lord names certain people, for example, by name that's going to do the work on the tabernacle, because everything has to be done perfectly. Also, there's regulations there about sacrifices and a lot of other things that will be towards the end of the book. And we'll talk about all of that later. But tonight we'll finish up the section about the history of the children of Israel being delivered from Egypt and then going out into the wilderness where they are there for 40 years because of their lack of faith. They could have gone on into the promised land a long time ago, but they didn't because of their lack of faith. And so as a result of it, this is their punishment. The people 20 years old and older are the ones who will get to go into the promised land. But the people 20 years old and younger will go in the promised land, I'm sorry. And the people that are older than 20 will not go into the promised land. So we see that they're now in the wilderness, and of course they have needs for water and food and clothing, and God is going to take care of all of that. And what I'd like to read first is from Exodus chapter 16, starting with verse number 11. And this has to do with the food that God sent to them. You remember now, this is a very large group of people that are out there in the wilderness. And this is, the Bible says there were 600,000 men who left Egypt, not counting the women and the children. So, it's estimated usually there's probably about 3 million people at least that came out. So this is a large group of people to have to take care of in the wilderness. And if I'm not mistaken, that would be about the population of Kentucky. Is that correct? About 3 million? I'm thinking that would be like the population of Kentucky that he would have to deal with out there in the wilderness. So that's an astronomical figure. So Bruce is going to read to us from chapter 16, verses 11 to 18, if you wish to follow along at this time, about how they were fed there in the wilderness.
And the Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, I have heard the murmuring of the children of Israel. Speak unto them, saying, At eve ye shall eat flesh, and in the morning ye shall be filled with bread, and ye shall know that I am the Lord your God. And it came to pass that eve the quail came up and covered the camp, and in the morning the dew lay round about the host. And when the dew that lay was gone up, behold, upon the face of the wilderness there lay a small round thing, as small as a hoarfrost on the ground. And when the children of Israel saw it, they said one to another, It is manna. For they wist not what it was. And Moses said unto them, This is the bread which the Lord hath given you to eat. This is the thing which the Lord hath commanded. Gather of it every man according to his eating, an omer for every man, according to the number of your persons. Take ye every man for them which are in his tents. And the children of Israel did so, and gathered some more, and some less. And when they did met it with an omer, I'll get it out in a minute here. He that gathered much had nothing over, and he that gathered little had no lack. They gathered every man according to his eating.
All right, so they collected this manna, which was like a coriander seed, and it was flaky like and sweet, like a wafer. And so this is what they had as far as their bread. And it came down, of course, at night and was there in the morning for them, and it disappeared when the sun came out. They had to get up and collect it. They would collect enough for their daily needs, and that's all. If they collected more than that, it would rot and it would stink, and so they were allowed to collect on the sixth day. They were allowed to collect enough for the Sabbath on the seventh day, and so that they could have enough for the Sabbath. They weren't allowed to go out on the Sabbath day and collect it. If they did, they got out and did it, they wouldn't find any. They got enough for each household. And the Lord did this then for 40 years, a full time that they were in the wilderness. Now, we're going to see a continuation of this description in chapter 16, starting with verse number 31. So go ahead and read that.
The people of Israel called the bread manna. It was white like coriander seed and tasted like wafers made with honey. Moses said, This is what the Lord has commanded. Take an omer of manna and keep it for the generations to come, so they can see the bread I gave you to eat in the wilderness when I brought you out of Egypt. So Moses said to Aaron, Take a jar and put an omer of manna in it. Then place it before the Lord to be kept for the generations to come. As the Lord commanded Moses, Aaron put the manna with the tablets of the covenant law so that it might be preserved. The Israelites ate manna 40 years until they came to a land that was settled. They ate manna until they reached the border of Canaan. An omer is 1/10 of an ephah.
All right, so most of the footnotes on the amount of an omer would be about 6 pounds, which is quite a bit. And so we see here that they were also to preserve a jar of this, which would be placed. Now later on, of course, in this book we read about them building the Ark of the Covenant to go in the tabernacle where they worshiped. And that box held 3 things. It held Aaron's rod and the tablets of stone where the 10 Commandments were written, and then a jar of this manna. So it was preserved all of those years to remind the people of how God cared for them in the wilderness. Now, In chapter 17 of Exodus, we read about water coming from a rock and how Moses is commanded to strike the rock. But after this reading, I'll bring your attention to Numbers 20, when Moses strikes a rock and water does come out, but he made the Lord angry. And we'll read about why that happened like that. So at this time, we'll have the reading of chapter 17, verses 2 through 6, if you wish to follow along in your Bibles.
So they quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." Moses replied, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test?" But the people were thirsty for water there, and they grumbled against Moses. They said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst?" Then Moses cried out to the Lord, "What am I to do with these people? They are almost ready to stone me." The Lord answered Moses, "Go out in front of the people, take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink." So Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel.
All right, now we'll bring your attention now, if you wish to turn to Numbers chapter 20. Towards the end of Moses' life, his sister had passed away, Miriam, and people were upset at him again, as they did many times throughout the years that he was with them. And they were demanding water. And in Numbers chapter 20, starting with verse 6, we have these words. Moses and Aaron went from the assembly to the entrance to the tent of meeting. That's where the tabernacle was. That's the place of worship. And fell face down. And the glory of the Lord appeared to them. The Lord said to Moses, "Take the staff, and you and your brother Aaron gather the assembly together." Now notice this very carefully. "Speak to that rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water." Now remember, in the one that was read here by Jamie, he was told to strike the rock. Here he's told to speak to the rock. "You will bring water out of the rock for the community so they and their livestock can drink." Now Moses is upset at these people, which I can understand that. We all can. But verse 9 says, "So Moses took the staff from the Lord's presence just as he commanded him. He and Aaron gathered the assembly together in front of the rock. And Moses said to them, 'Listen, you rebels. Must we bring you water out of this rock?'" Meaning his brother and himself. Then Moses raised his arm and struck the rock twice with his staff. Water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I gave them." So we see that this was the sin that caused Moses not to enter into the promised land with the people. He was able to see it, but he's not able to go in. And it's because God did not get the glory. So I just wanted you to be aware of the difference between speaking to the rock and then striking the rock. Even though God at one time told him to strike it, the other time he told him to speak to it so that God would get the glory for it instead of Moses and Aaron. Now in chapter 17, we have an interesting account here of a war that's going on with some of the people in Canaan land. Remember, they had to go and fight against all these different nations there. And there was a group of people called Amalekites. And we're going to see an interesting thing about how they're defeated. So go ahead and read 17:10 to 13. All right, so here, this is the picture then. You got Moses sitting on a rock, and as long as his arms are held up, Joshua is able to lead the Israelites to defeat the enemy. But when his arms became tired and they dropped, the enemy was winning. It's one of those miracles again that we talked about once before. We talked about the miracles of the Old Testament. So we see then that these two men, Joshua and Hur, would get on either side of Moses and hold his hands up. And of course, this is a good illustration about how God's people ought to do to their leaders as well. I've heard E.W. Dameron talk about this before, minister at Coal Run Church of Christ. And he says, Lord, let's hold up their hands. In other words, let's support our leaders. And so this is a real good example of supporting God's leaders and assisting them in their work for God. In chapter 18, we're going to read about Jethro, also known as Reuel, who is Moses' father-in-law. Jethro was a priest of Midian, and I often wondered, well, does that mean that he was a priest of Jehovah God? And I'm sure he was, because Midian was also one of the names of the children of Israel that were descendants of Abraham. So he was a priest of God, and he's going to give Moses some advice, which is very practical advice for the church even today, for leaders today. So starting with chapter 18, verse 13, let's read about Jethro's advice to Moses.
And it came to pass on the morrow that Moses sat to judge the people, and the people stood by Moses from the morning until the evening. And when Moses' father-in-law saw all that he did to the people, he said, What is this that thou doest to the people? Why sittest thou thyself alone, and all the people stand by thee from morning until even? Do you want me to go on with 17?
Yeah, go on with 17 to 24.
And Moses' father-in-law said unto him, The thing that doesn't is not good. Thou wilt surely wear away, both thou and this people that is with thee, for this thing is too heavy for thee. Thou art not able to perform it thyself alone. Hearken now unto my voice. I will give thee counsel, and God shall be with thee. Be thou for the people to Godward, that thou mayest bring the causes unto God. And thou shalt teach them ordinance and laws, and shall shew them the way wherein they must walk, and the work that they must do. Moreover, thou shalt provide out of all the people able men such as fear God, men of truth, hating controversy, and place such over them to the rulers of the thousands, and rulers of hundreds, rulers of fifties, and rulers of tens. And let them judge the people at all seasons. And it shall be that even great matter they shall bring unto thee, but every small matter they shall judge. So shall it be for thyself, and they shall bear the burden with thee. If thou shalt do this thing, and God command thee so, then thou shalt be able to endure, and all this people shall be also go to their place in peace. So Moses hearkened to the voice of his father-in-law, and did all the things he had said.
All right, can you imagine Moses taking care of all of these problems that people bring to him all by himself? And first of all, it was hard on him. And secondly, it was hard on the people, like it was brought out here in the reading there that Sheila gave us, that the people were standing a long time to get help. So he said, so he broke it down. He said, get rulers over thousands, and rulers over hundreds, and rulers over 50s, and even rulers over 10 people. And let them take care of the smaller cases, the smaller problems, and you take care of the big ones. It's sort of like the difference between our court system. You have the lower courts, you have the state Supreme Court, in the county courts, the state Supreme Court, the Supreme Court of the United States, and I guess then that would make Moses the head of the Supreme Court at this time. But you could see how that was a very wise advice that was given to Moses by his brother-in-law, and it was humble. It was really commendable that Moses would go ahead and do as she read in the last statement there. Moses listened to his father-in-law and did everything he said. So Moses was humble enough to accept his advice. And that's one thing about Moses. He was a very humble leader. And we're going to have our last reading tonight is from chapter 19. And this is where God is preparing the people to surround Mount Sinai, and as Moses received the Ten Commandments for the first time. Now, you remember it happened twice, because after the first time he came down the mountain with the commandments, after having been up there 40 days and 40 nights, he found the people, Aaron had made the golden calf for them, and they were dancing around and doing like the heathens do, and so Moses broke those plates. But this is the first time we're going to read about here. They're getting them prepared for Moses to go up into the mountain and receive them. Now, in the book of Hebrews, there's a reference to what is happening here in Exodus, and about this mountain and how it trembled and how smoke came out of it, and how the people were warned, don't go near it. If you do, if you touch it when God descends on it, you're going to die, whether you're a human or an animal. Now, sometimes God allowed Aaron to go up with Moses. Sometimes Moses was by himself. And even Joshua was allowed to go up on the second occasion that he did it. But it was a very terrifying thing to the people because the mountain itself shaking. They probably thought there was going to be an earthquake or something. But God is trying to prepare the people for this event. And Brandon is going to read several sections here from chapter 19 about God preparing the people for the time when Moses is going to receive the Ten Commandments. So he's going to read starting with verse number 5 through 7. Then he'll pick up with verse 10. And then he'll read to 13. Then he'll pick up with 16 through 19. I want you to get the feel of this instead of reading the whole chapter. What he's going to read will give you the feel of what God was trying to prepare them for. So go ahead, Brandon.
Now, if you obey me fully, and I keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites. So Moses went back and summoned the elders of the people and set before them all the words the Lord had commanded him to speak. And the Lord said to Moses, "Go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow. Have them wash their clothes and be ready by the third day, because on that day the Lord will come down to Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. Put limits for the people around the mountain and tell them, 'Be careful that you do not approach the mountain or touch the foot of it. Whoever touches the mountain is to be put to death. They are to be stoned or shot with arrows. Not a hand is to be laid on them. No person or animal shall be permitted to live. Only when the ram's horn sounds a long blast may they approach the mountain.' On the morning of the third day there was thunder and lightning, with a thick cloud over the mountain, and a very loud trumpet blast. Everyone in the camp trembled. Then Moses led the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai was covered with smoke, because the Lord descended on it in fire. The smoke billowed up from it like smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently. As the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and the voice of God answered him."
All right. That concludes our lesson for tonight, and next week we start with the Ten Commandments and other laws that were given to Moses for them as a nation. And before we dismiss, though, do you have any comments on what we read tonight?